She sang for an hour after midnight, and nobody went to check on her. There is a room, 12 feet by 12 feet. One bed, 3 tables, a fireplace that draws badly when the wind is wrong, a print on the wall of a woman looking out to sea for a boat that is not coming. The door has no key. You get in through the broken window. You have been getting in through the broken window for 8 months. There is a man who visits every evening and sits in the chair for half an hour and asks if you need anything. He used to live here. He left 3 weeks ago and is still deciding whether the leaving is permanent. There is a name that belongs to you. You have used several. There is a city outside that is more frightened than it has been in living memory. 4 women have been killed since August, all within walking distance, all within a quarter mile of this court, and none of them have been the last. Everyone in Whitechapel knows they have not been the last. The newspapers have given the killer a name, and the name has spread through the lodging houses and the public houses and the street corners and been spoken in the dark by women who have to go out at night regardless. There is a man you will meet on Commercial Street at 2 in the morning who will ask you for a sixpence. You have already spent yours. There is a man you will meet after that, well dressed, a gold chain in his waistcoat, kid gloves in his hand. You will lead him through the passage into the court. A neighbor will watch from across the street for 45 minutes and then go home. A neighbor above will hear 2 words through the floor and turn over and go back to sleep. There is a morning coming. A lamplighter will turn off the gas lamp at the entrance to the passage at 7. At 10:30, a young man with a rent book will come through the passage and knock on your door and get no answer. He will go around to the window. He will reach through the broken pane and pull the coat aside. What he sees in that room he will carry for the rest of his life. In the streets outside the court, when they carry you out, the crowd that has gathered will say, "God forgive her. We will not forget her." Nobody has forgotten her. You are 25 years old. Your name is Mary Jane Kelly. It is the evening of the 8th of November, 1888, and you are standing in a doorway on Dorset Street in Whitechapel, London. And tonight is the last night of your life, and you are going to sing. This is Quiet History at Bedtime. If this is your kind of story, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this story comes from the historical record. Just relax and feel free to let this play as you drift off to sleep. Now, let us begin. Your name is Mary Jane Kelly. You are 25 years old and you are standing in the doorway of number 13 Miller's Court, which is a single room at the back of 26 Dorset Street, Spitalfields, in the East End of London. The year is 1888. The month is November. The evening is cold enough that the fog you breathe out is visible, a small cloud that forms and vanishes, and you watch it for a moment before you pull your shawl tighter across your shoulders and look out at the court. Miller's Court is not a street, it is a passage, a narrow opening between the buildings on Dorset Street, wide enough for 2 people to pass if neither of them is carrying anything. The passage runs back about 30 feet and then opens into a small courtyard. The courtyard has 6 rooms around it, all of them let separately by the landlord, John McCarthy, who runs the chandler's shop at the front of 26 Dorset Street. You have not paid rent in 5 weeks. The total arrears are 29 shillings. You are aware of the 29 shillings, the way you are aware of the cold, not as a specific thought, but as a presence. It sits in the background of everything. To understand how Mary Jane Kelly came to stand in this doorway on this November evening, you need to understand what Whitechapel was. Not the Whitechapel that would later be written about in books and reconstructed in walking tours. The actual Whitechapel. The Whitechapel that existed as a physical and economic reality in the autumn of 1888. London in 1888 was the largest city on earth. 4.5 million people. The British Empire at its greatest extent, India, Australia, Canada, a third of the surface of the planet flying the Union Jack, and here, in the East End, less than a mile from the Bank of England, there was a district where 189 people lived in every acre of land, compared to 45 per acre in the rest of London. Where 8,000 people slept in common lodging houses every night, paying 4p for a bed in a room shared with strangers, or 8p for a double bed, or less than that for a place on a bench with a rope strung in front of you to lean on, which was called a 2p hangover, and was as close to sleep as some people ever got. Whitechapel had slaughterhouses. It had tanneries. It had the kind of small workshops, sweated trades they were called, where women sewed garments 12 hours a day for wages that did not cover rent. It had 45 public houses, roughly one on every corner of every major road. It had 233 registered common lodging houses. It had, according to police estimates made in October of that same year, approximately 1,200 women working as prostitutes within its boundaries. That number was not a scandal. That number was a consequence of wages too low to live on, of a labor market that had almost no use for women who were not in service or in a factory, of a housing situation so desperate that a woman without a man to share the rent was one bad week away from the street. You understand all of this not as history, but as the conditions of your life. You step back inside and close the door. The room is dim. The one candle you have, you bought it this morning at McCarthy's shop, spent a halfpenny you did not have to spare, is sitting on the table nearest the fireplace. The fireplace is the most important thing in this room. The room has one window, facing the court, the glass cracked in the lower right corner, and patched with a rag and an old coat that Maria Harvey left behind when she moved her things out 2 days ago. Without a fire, the room holds nothing. The night temperature in November in London can fall to near freezing. You kneel in front of the fireplace and look at what is left of yesterday's coal. There is not much. McCarthy sells coal by the bucket at the front of the shop, and you have been managing it carefully all week, banking it low at night, letting it breathe back up in the morning. A bucket of coal costs a penny halfpenny. You have been thinking about that penny halfpenny since this afternoon. You take the poker and draw the remaining coals together into the center of the grate and lay 2 more pieces on top. Smaller ones, the kind that catch quickly. You hold the poker still for a moment and watch the orange edge brighten around the new coal, the way it moves across the surface and then steadies into a glow. The warmth reaches your face. Your hands are cold. They are always cold by the end of the day, and you stay crouched in front of the fire longer than you need to, letting the heat work into the joints of your fingers. The room itself had been the back parlor of 26 Dorset Street before McCarthy partitioned the building and began letting the back rooms separately. The wooden partition wall that now formed the front of your room was thin enough that sound passed through it easily. You had heard your neighbors through it often enough, conversations, arguments, a baby crying 2 rooms down in the early mornings. The key to the door had gone missing months ago, and neither you nor Joe had ever replaced it. You reached through the broken pane in the window and turned the catch from the inside, and that was how you came home. Joe Barnett. His name surfaces in the cold of the room the way it has been surfacing for 2 weeks now, since the 30th of October, when he took his things from the shelf above the fireplace and moved them to a lodging house on New Street, a place called Buller's. He still came round. He had come round this evening, in fact, between 7:30 and 8, sat in the chair by the table, talked to you for a while in the way he had been talking since he left, carefully, the way a person talks when they are hoping that enough careful conversation will repair something that broke for reasons neither of you has fully named. He had asked if you needed anything. You had told him you were all right. He had stayed half an hour and then gone. Joseph Barnett was 29 years old. He had blue eyes and fair hair and a moustache that was considered fashionable in Whitechapel in 1888. He had grown up in the East End, lost both his parents by the time he was 13, been taken in by his siblings, and eventually set to work at Billingsgate Fish Market through his brother's connection. Billingsgate was the great wholesale fish market of London, situated on the north bank of the Thames near London Bridge, and the work of a licensed fish porter there, carrying the baskets, moving the product from the boats to the market floor to the buyer's cart, was skilled enough to require a license, and paid well enough to be the difference between a room and no room, between rent and arrears. Joe had held that license and that job for years, and while he held it, you had not needed the streets. He lost the job in July. The reason given was theft, a small theft, fish, the kind of thing the market turned a blind eye to until it stopped turning a blind eye. And after July there was no license, no Billingsgate, no steady income. By August you were back on Commercial Street in the evenings. By September the arrears had started. Above the fireplace, on the small mantelpiece, there is nothing left of Joe's. What had been there, a pipe, 2 small coins he kept separate for reasons he never explained, a folded piece of paper with a note on it in his handwriting, is gone to Buller's with him. What remains on the mantelpiece is yours, a comb with 2 teeth missing, a small piece of soap, a tin that once held tobacco and now holds nothing. The print on the wall catches your eye the way it always does in the evenings when the candlelight is low and moving. It is called The Fisherman's Widow. It shows a woman standing at a cliff's edge, looking out to sea, and she is looking for a boat that is not coming. You have been looking at this print for 8 months, since February when you and Joe moved into this room, and you have never decided whether the woman in the print knows yet that the boat is not coming, or whether she is still hoping. You reach under the bed and pull out the small tin bath. You fill it from the water jug. The water is cold. It has been sitting in the jug since this morning. And you wash your face and your hands and as much of yourself as the cold water and the small room allow. This is something you have kept to through everything. A clean white apron in the mornings, your hair combed before you went out, your face and hands washed at the end of the day. Walter Dew, the detective constable who walked this beat, would later write that he knew you by sight and that you were always neatly dressed, always wearing the white apron, never a hat. You had no hat. A hat cost more than you had ever managed to set aside at once for something that was not rent or food or coal. The candle is burning lower. You have 1 candle. When it is gone, the room will be dark. You are not afraid of the dark. You were one of 7 children in a house in Wales where the candles were managed carefully and darkness was simply what the night was made of. But the dark in a room where you are alone is a different quality of dark than the dark in a house full of sleeping children, and you know this now in a way you did not know it then. You think about Ireland. Lizzie Albrook, who lives in Miller's Court, had asked you once why you stayed. You had told her, and this is something Lizzie Albrook repeated to the inquest jury 3 days after your death, that you were heartily sick of the life you were leading, and that you wished you could go back to Ireland, where your people lived. Your people. You had not seen them since Wales. Your family had moved from Limerick to Carnarvonshire when you were a small child. Your father, John Kelly, an iron worker, had followed the work to the Welsh quarries and mines the way Irish families did in those decades, following the industrial expansion north and east and into England itself. You had 6 brothers at home when you were growing up, a brother in the army, a sister who worked the markets. You had married a man named Davies when you were 16, a collier working the seams somewhere in the valleys, and he had died in a mining explosion 2 or 3 years later. And after that there was Cardiff first, then London, then the West End for a few years, then this. The mining explosion had not been reported in any newspaper you ever saw. It was a local event, a pit in the valleys, the name of the colliery forgotten or never clearly known. A number of men killed that was not large enough to make the national press. The explosions that made the newspapers were the catastrophic ones, the ones with dozens of dead, the ones that destroyed a village's working-age male population in a single morning. The smaller ones, 3 men, 5 men, 8 men, were absorbed by the communities that experienced them as the cost of the work, the risk that was understood to exist and that manifested periodically in exactly this way. And then life went on, because life went on. Davies was gone. You were 18 or 19, and you had a dead husband and no income and no particular standing in a Welsh mining village that had no specific obligation to you. Your cousin in Cardiff was the practical option. Cardiff in the early 1880s was a growing city. The coal trade that fed the Welsh mines also fed the Cardiff docks, which exported the coal to the rest of the world, and the city around the docks was expanding rapidly. New streets and new lodging houses and new public houses and a transient population of dock workers and sailors and the women who moved in the spaces around that population. Your cousin was part of that world. You became part of it through her. How long you were in Cardiff is not precisely known. A year, perhaps 2. Long enough to understand the work, to learn the geography of it, to develop the practical knowledge that the work required and that could not be learned from books. Long enough to decide that Cardiff was not where you wanted to remain. The West End of London was the version of the future that the women you knew in Cardiff spoke about as something better. Better clients, better conditions, something approaching a different kind of life. Some women had gone there and sent back money. Some women had gone there and disappeared entirely. You went and found something in between. A gentleman had taken you to France once, 10 days. Paris, or somewhere near Paris. You had come back after 10 days and told people that France did not suit you. You were perhaps 19 years old and you had seen Paris and come back to London, and that was the choice you made, and if there was a reason for it, you never told anyone what it was. By 1884, you were in the East End. By April of 1887, you were with Joe Barnett, who met you on Good Friday on Commercial Street, took you for a drink, and on the next day proposed that you live together. You had moved 4 times in 18 months. George Street, Little Paternoster Row, Brick Lane, then here. And the moves were the map of a financial situation that had been precarious for years and was now, in November 1888, at its worst point yet. You blow out the candle. The room goes dark except for the orange glow of the fire, which moves on the walls and the ceiling in slow patterns, throwing shadows that elongate and contract and elongate again. In the firelight, the room looks different than it does in daylight. Larger, almost. The corners disappear. The cracked window pane with its rags and its coat is just a dark shape. The print is just a pale rectangle above the mantelpiece. The room at night is something other than what it is in the day, and you have learned in 8 months in this room how to inhabit both versions. The fire settles. A coal shifts and drops, and the light changes briefly, and then steadies. You are not ready to go out yet. You sit with the firelight for a while longer. Outside in the court you can hear the usual sounds, footsteps on the cobbles, a voice from somewhere overhead, the distant roll of a cart on Dorset Street, and underneath all of it, the low, continuous noise of the city doing the things that cities do in the evenings. Too many parts to separate, too many people, and too many wheels, and too many voices, and too many fires burning in too many grates. You have been listening to that sound for 5 years. You stand up, you find the shawl on the back of the chair and wrap it around your shoulders. You take the empty water jug to the communal tap in the court and fill it. The water runs cold and clear, the cast iron tap wet under your fingers. You carry the jug back inside and set it on the table, and stand for a moment in the doorway before you close the door. The fog is thicker now than it was an hour ago. The gas lamp at the entrance to the court puts a cone of yellow light into the fog, and the fog softens it, and the whole passage glows slightly in that way that London fog does when there is a light source nearby. Not illuminated exactly, but luminous, as if the fog itself is generating a pale, diffuse light of its own. The night is going to be long. You know this the way you know the cold, as a given, as the shape of the thing you are in. November nights in Whitechapel ran from darkness at 5 in the afternoon to a gray, reluctant light at 7 the next morning. That was 14 hours. 14 hours in which the question of how to keep the rent from falling further behind had to be answered in the only way you currently had to answer it. You go inside. You put on the apron. The apron is white cotton, practical, the kind that tied at the waist and had a bib that came up to the chest. You had always worn a white apron. There was something in the wearing of a clean white apron in a place like Dorset Street that functioned as a statement of a kind. Not the kind anyone would write down or put into words, but the kind that is made by the act of maintaining one small, precise standard in conditions that would have excused maintaining nothing. You look at yourself in the small piece of glass propped against the wall above the table. A mirror fragment Joe had left behind, really. Blue eyes, fair complexion, what the Daily Telegraph would describe in tomorrow's paper, in the past tense, as an attractive appearance. You are 25 years old. You straighten your back. You fix the apron. You go out into Miller's Court. The fog receives you. The cobblestones are damp under your feet. You pass through the passage and out onto Dorset Street, and the noise of the street comes up around you, a man shouting from an upper window, the sound of breaking glass somewhere to the left. a group of women in a doorway across the street. Dorset Street in 1888 was known to the police as the worst street in London. This was not hyperbole. It was the considered assessment of the H Division constables who walked its length every shift, who knew its lodging houses by name, who knew which doorways were regularly occupied at which hours. Dorset Street ran east to west, connecting Commercial Street to Crispin Street, a distance of perhaps 200 yards, and along those 200 yards it contained more registered lodging houses per square foot than almost any other street in the city. McCarthy's Buildings at number 26, where your room was. Crossingham's at 35, where Annie Chapman had stayed. The Britannia pub on the corner at Commercial Street, where you were known. You walk west along Dorset Street toward Commercial Street. The evening is thick with people. A man is selling hot chestnuts from a brazier on the corner, the coal glow of the brazier making a warm circle in the fog, and the smell of the chestnuts reaches you 20 feet away, hot, sweet, slightly charred, and you have not eaten since this afternoon. You walk past the chestnut seller without stopping. Commercial Street runs north to south, wider than Dorset Street, with the traffic that a main thoroughfare carries. The gas lamps here are spaced more closely, and the light is better, though still the particular yellowish London gaslight that made everyone look slightly ill and softened the edges of everything it touched. The pavements were crowded. Thursday evening in Whitechapel meant the weekly paid dock workers and casual laborers who had been paid that day, and paid men in Whitechapel moved toward the public houses the way water moved toward the lowest point. You turn north on Commercial Street, toward Fournier Street, toward the 10 Bells. The 10 Bells stood on the corner of Commercial Street and Fournier Street, directly across from the steps of Christ Church. It had been on that corner since the middle of the last century. The current building, constructed in 1851, a brick and plaster public house 3 floors high, its ground floor decorated with Victorian tiling in blue and white, the interior gas-lit and warm and smelling of beer and sawdust, and the concentrated presence of many people in a small space. You push open the door, and the warmth hits you first. There was a specific quality to the warmth of a Victorian public house on a cold evening that had no equivalent anywhere else. It was warmth made of gas flames and body heat, and the heat of the brewing itself, concentrated in a low-ceilinged room, and after the fog and the damp of the street it was the thing the body registered first, before sound or smell or sight. You have been coming into this pub since you arrived in Spitalfields, and the warmth has never felt like anything other than a small physical mercy. The bar was busy. Thursday evenings usually were. Men from the docks, from the market, from the workshops. You knew several of the faces. Not well, in most cases. Whitechapel was a neighborhood where you could know a face for years without knowing the name behind it, where the transience of lodging house life meant that the same face might disappear for a season and then reappear, older and thinner, and you would nod without acknowledgement, and that would be the full extent of it. You ordered a glass of gin. The gin cost 1.5 pennies in 1888. It was not good gin. The gin sold in East End public houses in the 1880s was almost never good gin, being largely a grain spirit cut with turpentine or sulfuric acid by the cheaper suppliers and sweetened to cover it. But it was warm, and it cut through the cold that had been sitting in the back of your throat since you stepped outside, and you held the glass with both hands for a moment before you drank it, extracting the warmth before everything else. You had been drinking gin since Cardiff, not heavily, Not in the way that some women in Whitechapel drank, which was a different thing entirely. The drinking that came from a specific kind of despair that you had seen in the lodging houses and did not want to become, the kind that was visible in the face and the walk and the way a woman held herself at a bar at 2 in the morning. You drank the way your mother had drunk, occasionally, and with the deliberateness of a person who understands that a glass of something in the evening is a small mercy and not a coping strategy. There was a difference. You had kept track of that difference through everything. The barman set the second glass down without being asked. He had been behind this bar long enough to know which regulars needed prompting and which didn't, and he had you categorized correctly. You gave him a nod. The names came to you in the warmth of the pub, the way they always did now. Polly, that was the first. Mary Ann Nichols, 43 years old, found in Bucks Row on the 31st of August. She had been turned away from her lodgings that night because she lacked the fourpence for a bed. Turned away at the door of Wilmot's lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, which was 30 seconds' walk from the 10 Bells. You had not known her well, but you had known her face, had seen it at this bar, had seen it on Commercial Street in the evenings, in the way that you saw everyone's face eventually if you worked the same stretch of pavement long enough. Her face was the face of a woman in her 40s who had been living rough for a long time. Not unkind, not hard, just weathered. The particular kind of weathering that came from years of needing the fourpence, and sometimes having it, and sometimes not. She had been trying to raise the fourpence when she died. Annie Chapman, 47 years old, found in the yard at 29 Hanbury Street on the 8th of September. You had known Annie better. Annie had come into the 10 Bells, had used Commercial Street as her pitch the way you used it yourself, had the same constellation of friends and acquaintances that everyone in this part of Whitechapel had, an overlapping web of women who knew each other by name and face, and the small currency of shared help, a coin lent on a bad Tuesday. Information about a constable who had been walking the wrong beat at the wrong hour. The name of a lodging house that was less terrible than the others, that had a deputy who didn't steal from the residents and kept the fire in the common room going until 10. Annie had been ill in the weeks before she died. Tuberculosis, some people said, or something like it. The kind of illness that the East End bred in its populations through cold and overcrowding and the lack of anything that could be called adequate nutrition. The kind of illness that took decades to kill you, and in the meantime made the work harder and the cold more present and the fourpence more necessary and more difficult to find. You had seen her in the Britannia 10 days before, and she had looked worse than you had ever seen her, and you had said something to her. You couldn't remember what exactly, something ordinary, something about the weather, and she had smiled the way she always smiled, which was with the whole face, and then she had gone out, and you had not seen her again. And then Elizabeth, the 30th of September. Elizabeth Stride, 44 years old, in Berner Street. And then Kate, the same night. Catherine Eddowes, 46, in Mitre Square, which was in the City of London, just over the boundary, which meant a different police force, different jurisdiction, different newspapers covering the story with different angles. 2 in one night. You had not been able to fix it as a fact for several hours when you heard. The neighborhood had changed after that. You had felt it change in the way you felt everything in Whitechapel change, not as a single event, but as a shift in the texture of things, the way the same street felt different at the same hour for days afterward, the way conversations between women on the corner had a new quality, shorter and more careful, The way the gaps between the gas lamps seemed longer than they had before. The women who worked the streets had changed how they worked them. Some had stopped working certain hours entirely, absorbing the loss in rent and food because the alternative was the street after midnight, and the street after midnight was now a different calculation. Some worked in pairs, which halved the money but changed the mathematics of safety in ways that were not entirely rational but were not irrational either. Some kept to the same hours and the same streets and made no change at all, because they had no margin for change, because the fourpence had to come from somewhere, and the somewhere was the same somewhere it had always been. You were in the last category. You needed the rent money. The rent money required the streets required the evenings, and so you were sitting in the 10 Bells on the evening of the 8th of November, because where else would you be? The police had been everywhere since August. H Division, the Whitechapel Division, whose patch covered the geography of the murders, had been reinforced with detectives from the Criminal Investigation Department, had been augmented by officers from other divisions, had at various points deployed officers in plain clothes, officers in women's clothing, officers walking beats so dense that there was barely a corner of Whitechapel that wasn't within sight of a constable at any given hour of the night. The newspapers had praised this. The newspapers had also blamed the police for failing to catch the killer in spite of it. Inspector Aberlin had given interviews. Scotland Yard had issued statements. The commissioner had resigned, though not over the murders specifically, over a separate political matter that happened to coincide with the worst weeks of the autumn. The machinery of official response had been very visible and very loud, and had produced nothing. The women of Whitechapel had their own intelligence network, which was quieter and more practical. What street? What hour? What the man looked like who had been asking questions in a way that felt wrong? Which lodging houses had rooms without windows? Which was considered less safe now, though the logic was not entirely clear. The network ran through the public houses and the doss houses and the cook shops and the street corners, where women stood in pairs and talked while appearing to be doing nothing in particular. You were part of it. You had been part of it since August. Information came to you and you passed it on, and it went somewhere, and perhaps it helped and perhaps it didn't, and in any case the streets were still the streets and the evenings were still the evenings. You set down the glass. The warmth of the pub was real, but it was also temporary. Eventually the evening closed and the streets reopened, and the question of the rent reasserted itself with all its practical weight. You straightened on the stool. You smoothed the white apron. You looked at the door. You went out. The cold received you again immediately. The fog was dense enough now that Christ Church across the street was barely visible, the great white stone frontage of Nicholas Hawksmoor's masterpiece, built in 1729 on the edge of the old Spitalfields market, reduced by November fog to a pale suggestion of itself, the columns barely readable, the steps at its base faint and gray, the bells were visible only as sound. You turned south on Commercial Street, walking slowly. The evening sounds came to you through the fog in that slightly muffled, directionally confused way that fog produced. Voices seemed to come from the wrong places. Footsteps arrived without obvious source. The city sounded larger than it was and closer at the same time. There was a particular skill to working this street in fog. The fog made faces less visible from a distance, which meant that the moment of recognition came later. You were closer to a man before you could read him. closer before he could read you, and the whole sequence of approach and response that the work required was compressed into a shorter space and a shorter time. You had learned to adjust for this. The walk changed slightly in fog, slower, more present, giving each encounter its full attention rather than skimming from a distance. A man stopped near the corner of Flower and Dean Street. He was in his 30s, a billycock hat, a coat that was shabby at the elbows. He said something to you, and you answered, and you stood talking for a few minutes in the fog, and then he moved on, and you continued south. Nothing came of it. Many evenings were like this, conversations that went nowhere, men who looked for longer than they stopped, the slow accumulation of small encounters that added up, some evenings to enough and other evenings to nothing at all. Flower and Dean Street was to your left as you walked south, a narrow road that ran east from Commercial Street and was known, along with Thrall Street and Dorset Street, as one of the 3 worst streets in Whitechapel. The lodging houses on Flower and Dean Street were larger and cheaper and rougher than the ones on Dorset Street, and 3 of the canonical 5 victims had lived in them at various points. There was a particular lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, 56, the White House, that was notorious even by the standards of the neighborhood, known for the bed sharing it permitted between men and women who were not known to each other, which was illegal under the lodging house regulations and widely practiced regardless. You had never lived in the White House. You had lived in worse places earlier before Joe, but not that one. Some lines you had kept. Lizzie Albrook appeared at the corner of Thrall Street, walking north. You had known Lizzie for most of the time you had been in Spitalfields. She was younger than you, had come to London from somewhere in the south, had a small room in Miller's Court on the other side of the passage from yours, and she had the quality that some young women in the neighborhood had and others didn't, of not having been entirely worn down yet, of still having something of the original person visible behind the circumstances. You liked her. You had told her things you did not tell many people. She stopped when she saw you. The 2 of you stood in the fog on Commercial Street for a few minutes, talking in the shorthand that women who knew each other well in Whitechapel used, compressed, information-dense, economical with words in the way of people who have other things to do. She asked how you were. You told her you were managing. She told you about something that had happened earlier that day on Dorset Street. A man who had been asking questions near the entrance to Miller's Court, the kind of questions the wrong kind of man asked. You filed it. You asked about Joe. She said she had seen him that afternoon near the market. You nodded. She went north and you went south, and the fog received you both. Mary Ann Cox came out of a doorway further along. You recognized her walk before you recognized her face. She lived at number 5 in Miller's Court, directly above your room. She nodded at you. You nodded back. She said something about the cold, and you agreed that it was cold, and she went in the direction of Dorset Street, and you continued. The street went on. The fog went on. The gas lamps made their yellow circles in the dark. Somewhere behind you, back toward Fournier Street, the bells of Christ Church rang the hour, 9 o'clock, and the sound came through the fog with that peculiar muted clarity that cold air produced, the individual strokes distinct and slow. 9 o'clock. The night was not yet half over. The streets of Whitechapel at 9 on a Thursday evening in November had their own logic, their own population, their own rhythms that were different from the rhythms of the streets at 6 or at midnight or at 3 in the morning. The pub-goers were still inside the pubs, mostly, the long evening not yet at its midpoint. The lodging house residents were still out raising their fourpences, the calculation not yet desperate. The costermongers and street sellers were beginning to pack up their barrows, the day trade done, though some would stay until midnight for the late-night traffic from the public houses. The constables were walking their beats in the steady, methodical way that constables walked them. Not fast, not slow, the pace of a man covering ground, covering the same ground he had covered last night and would cover tomorrow night. His route fixed and known and therefore, in one sense, predictable. You pulled the shawl tighter and kept walking, and the city folded itself around you the way it always did, the way it had been doing for 5 years, indifferent and perpetual, and you were one figure in it, a young woman with a white apron walking south on Commercial Street, visible for a moment in the cone of light beneath a gas lamp, and then absorbed again into the dark. It is nearly 11:45. You turn east off Commercial Street toward Miller's Court, because the night has turned cold enough that the cold is now the primary thing. You can feel it in the joints of your hands, in the back of your throat, in the way your feet have gone slightly numb inside your shoes despite the walking. The gin helped for a while, but the warmth does not last, and you have been outside since then, and the cold has taken back everything the gin gave you. You turn into the passage of Miller's Court. The gas lamp at the entrance to the passage is burning. There is a man with you, a short, stout man in his mid-30s, a billycock hat pulled low, a dark overcoat that was shabby at the elbows, a carroty mustache and a blotchy face, and in his hand a can of beer, a quart pail of it. You are, as Mary Ann Cox will later testify at the inquest, very much intoxicated. The gin and the cold and the long evening have combined into a state that is not quite the world and not quite unconscious, something in between, a warm blur behind the eyes through which the familiar shapes of Miller's Court still register, the gas lamp, the passage walls, the cobblestones underfoot, the door of number 13 at the back of the court. Mary Ann Cox is coming in behind you. You hear her footsteps and you turn and say good night to her, and she says good night to you, and you tell her that you are going to sing. The man with the billycock hat closes the door. The room is warmer than the street, which is the first thing. The fire has burned lower while you were out, but there is still heat coming from the grate, and you kneel in front of it and add the last pieces of coal from the scuttle and watch them catch. The candle is where you left it. You light it from the fire. The small flame steadies, and the room comes into its evening configuration, the walls, the 3 tables, the print above the mantelpiece pale and quiet in the moving light. The man sets the beer on the table nearest the door. You begin to sing. The song is called A Violet from Mother's Grave, and you know every word of it because you have known it since Wales, since the house in Carnarvonshire where your mother used to sing it on certain evenings, the evenings when the tiredness of the week had settled into something softer and the children were not yet asleep and the house was warm. In the room in Miller's Court, with the candle lit and the fire catching and the gin warm in your blood, you sing it the way she sang it, without effort, without thought, as naturally as speaking. Singing was the thing you had always had. It was the thing people mentioned when they mentioned you, not the blue eyes or the height or the French trip or the white apron, but the voice. A good voice, the kind of voice that carried without pushing, that could fill a room and still sound intimate, that had a particular quality in Irish songs and in the songs that came from the Welsh valleys that you had absorbed by proximity without ever quite calling them your own. When you were drinking and the night had reached a certain point, the singing came up the way it always came up, not performed, not directed at anyone, just present, the way music is present when a person has been carrying it long enough. The song opens on a summer morning. A boy walks through a meadow on his way to visit his mother's grave. She is recently dead, and he brings violets. The verse describes the meadow, the path, the grave, the flowers. The chorus circles back to the grave and the love that remains after the person is gone. It is a Victorian parlor song, written in 1881 by a composer named Joseph Skelly, sold as sheet music, performed in music halls and front parlors, and eventually in every public house in England where someone knew the words. And it is also, underneath its Victorian sentiment, a song about the specific grief of losing a mother young, before you were ready, before you had said all the things you needed to say. You had been perhaps 8 years old when your mother sang it the first time. The house in Carnarvonshire, the fire, your brothers asleep already in the back room, you and your sister still awake at the kitchen table because you had been helping with something and had not yet been sent to bed. Your mother at the hearth, her back to you, singing to herself in the way that people sing when they have forgotten they have an audience. Not performing, not shaping the song for anyone, just letting it come out into the room because the room could hold it and the evening was quiet enough for it. The memory is in the body more than in the mind. The smell of that kitchen, the particular quality of firelight in a low-ceilinged Welsh house, the weight of tiredness at the end of a long day, the specific tiredness of a child who has been useful and is now being allowed to be still. Your mother's voice moving through the song, and the song moving through the room, and you not quite asleep and not quite awake, suspended in the space between the two. You are in that space now. The gin and the fire and the hour and the singing have brought you somewhere between here and there, between Miller's Court in November 1888 and a kitchen in Wales in the early 1870s, and in that space the distance between the two places is not very large, and your mother's voice and your own voice are not very different, and the song is the same song, and it fills the room the same way. Mary Ann Cox, in room 5 at the top of the court, can hear you through the walls. She will testify that you were still singing when she left her room at midnight, and that when she came back an hour later, at 1 in the morning, you were singing still or had begun again, and that there was light in your window. Elizabeth Prater, in the room directly above yours, will say she went to bed at 1:30 and the singing had stopped by then. A neighbor named Catherine Pickett, who lives 2 rooms along, will tell the inquest she was tempted to knock on your door to ask you to stop. Her husband talked her out of it. The song was carrying through the partition walls of Miller's Court and into the rooms on either side and the room above, threading through the thin wood and the thin plaster of a building that was never designed to keep sound in or out. And every neighbor in the court could hear it, and some of them lay in their beds listening, and some of them lay in their beds wishing it would stop, and some of them could not have said which. You sing for a long time. The man with the billycock hat sits at the table and drinks his beer, and you sing, and the candle burns, and the fire holds its warmth in the small room, and outside in the court the gas lamp burns its yellow circle at the entrance to the passage, and Dorset Street goes on doing what Dorset Street does, and it is midnight in Spitalfields, and then it is a little past midnight, and then it is later still. At some point the man with the billycock hat leaves. You do not remember exactly when. The gin and the hour and the warmth of the room have made the edges of things imprecise, and at some point you are aware that he is gone, and the door is closed, and the room is yours again, and the fire is lower, and the candle is burned further down its length. You are alone. The singing has stopped. You are sitting on the edge of the bed with the quiet of the room around you, and the quiet of Miller's Court beyond it, and the quiet of Whitechapel at 1 in the morning, which is not real quiet, it never is, but is the closest approach to quiet that this neighborhood makes. The noise settled into something lower, the public houses closing or closed, the street traffic reduced to occasional footsteps and the distant sound of a cart on Whitechapel Road. You lie back on the bed without undressing. The fire is low but not yet out. The candle is burning to its last inch. You look up at the ceiling of the room, which in the candlelight shows its cracks and patches, the water stain near the partition wall that had been there since before you moved in, the place near the window where the plaster had lost a patch the size of your hand. You have been looking at this ceiling for 8 months. 8 months since February, when you and Joe first opened the door of number 13 for the first time and stood in the doorway looking at the 12 by 12 space that was going to be yours. Joe had said it was small, and you had said that all rooms were small, and he had laughed. That was the thing about Joe. He laughed easily, a genuine laugh that came quickly and didn't seem to cost him anything. In the months when the Billingsgate wages came in regularly, and the rent was paid on time, and there was food enough and coal enough, the room had not felt like what it was. It had felt, on some evenings, like something else. On those evenings, the good evenings, the evenings when there was a fire and something to eat, and the rent was current, and Joe was in the chair with the newspaper open on his knee. The room was approximately the size of a life. He would come home from Billingsgate smelling of fish and cold river air, his boots wet from the dock, and he would take them off at the door the way he always did, and set them on the hearthstone to dry, and you would have the kettle on, and the two of you would eat whatever there was. Bread, sometimes a piece of something from the market, a penny's worth of eel in the weeks when there was money for it, and then he would open the newspaper and begin. He read the way men read who have taught themselves to read in adulthood, carefully and slightly slowly, giving each word its full weight, moving through a column the way a man moves through unfamiliar terrain, attentive, deliberate, finding the path as he went. You had grown up in a house where reading was different, where your father had read easily and your mother had read to the children from the Bible in the evenings, and so you knew the difference between Joe's reading and easier reading, but it didn't matter. His voice in the room was the thing. The particular sound of his voice going through the day's events, the shipping news, the parliamentary reports, the advertisements for establishments you would never enter, the prices at Covent Garden Market, the weather expected along the south coast, all of it coming through the same voice, in the same room, in the evenings. He had been a good man in a situation that made being good difficult. Billingsgate opened at 5 in the morning, 6 days a week, and the licensed porters who worked it, around 300 of them, holding the Billingsgate Fellowship license that allowed them to carry fish from the unloading boats to the market floor, and from the market floor to the buyers' vehicles, were on the dock before that, in the dark, in all weathers, loading and unloading the smacks and the trawlers that came up the Thames from the Kent and Essex fishing grounds and from further out in the North Sea. The work was physical in the way that dock work was physical, not skilled in the sense that a craftsman's work was skilled, but demanding in the sense that it required the body to do difficult things for many hours without stopping, and the body that did it wore out in specific ways in the back and the shoulders and the hands. Joe had done it for years. He was well built for it. Medium height, solid, the kind of build that Billingsgate required, and Billingsgate produced in the men who stayed. His hands were the hands of that work, large and calloused and always slightly cold. Even in summer, the cold of the river and the fish and the early mornings having worked itself into the tissue over years. When he held your hand, which he did sometimes, the coldness of his was specific and familiar, and nothing like the cold of the street. He lost the license in July. The reason was theft. Fish, a small amount. The kind of thing that happened on the docks, and was understood to happen on the docks, and was tolerated up to a point, and then was not tolerated. Joe had reached the point where it was not tolerated. The license was revoked. Without the license, there was no Billingsgate, and without Billingsgate, there was casual labor. The dock work that didn't require a license but paid less and offered no security. The kind of work where you showed up in the morning and might be taken on and might not, and the uncertainty of it compounded week by week through August and September into something that sat in the room between the two of you and didn't have a name but was felt constantly. By August, you were back on Commercial Street in the evenings. Joe knew and didn't say much directly, because saying much directly about it was a conversation that went nowhere good, and Joe was a man who preferred to avoid conversations that went nowhere good. The silences around the subject grew. The evenings became careful in the way that evenings in a small room become careful when two people are managing something that neither of them has named. And then the women. It had started with Julia, a woman Joe knew slightly from the neighborhood, who had nowhere to sleep one cold October night, and you had said she could stay, and she had stayed. And Joe had said nothing that first night, and not much the next day. And then she had stayed another night, and Joe had said something, and you had said something back. And the argument that followed was not entirely about Julia. It was about what letting Julia stay meant, and what it meant about you, and what it meant about the life you were in, and whether it was a life you were trying to leave or a life you were making permanent. You let Julia stay. Julia left after a few days, and Maria Harvey came. Maria was a laundress. She described herself as a laundress, which was the kind of casual domestic labor that kept many women in Whitechapel alive at the margin, taking in washing at a penny or twopence per item, doing the heavy work of other people's cleanliness for wages that were barely wages. Maria needed somewhere to stay while her own lodgings were sorted out. You said yes. Joe packed his things on the 30th of October and took them to Buller's on New Street, and that was where things were. The two of them reading the newspaper together. He read it aloud, his voice going through the columns while you sat with your hands in your lap and the fire going. The ordinary domestic sound of a man's voice in a warm room in the evening. He used to read you the Ripper reports. This is the detail that sits in the room with you now, in the quiet after the singing. The newspapers in August and September and October were full of the murders. The Whitechapel murders, Jack the Ripper, the Autumn of Terror, the phrases they used as if the terror were a season with a fixed ending. And Joe had read them aloud the way he read everything aloud, with the same steady voice. And you had listened, and the names of the dead women had come into the room the same way the names of everything else came in, through his voice, through the candlelight. Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Kate. You had asked him to keep reading even when the reading was difficult, because not knowing was worse than knowing. And he had read because that was the kind of man he was. Not a brilliant man, not an educated man, but a man who, when someone he loved asked him to do something that cost him something, generally did it. You think about Joe in the chair by the table, reading. The newspaper spread across his knee, his finger moving under the line as he read, the particular slight frown he got when he hit a word he wasn't certain of. Not a stupid frown, just a careful one. The frown of a man who took reading seriously and didn't want to get it wrong. He had left school at 13 after his parents died and had taught himself to read better in the years since. Had borrowed books from the library at Commercial Street when there was time, had the kind of self-educated person's respect for the printed word that came from having fought for access to it. He had been a good man in a situation that made being good difficult. You had not made it easier for him. You knew this. The women you let stay, Julia, Maria Harvey, the others you had taken in on cold nights because the alternative was leaving them on the street, and you could not do that, could not close the door on a woman standing in the November cold with nowhere to go, not when you knew what the November cold felt like from the outside of a door. Joe had asked you to stop. You had not stopped. That was the argument at its root. Not the drinking, not the money, not the streets, but the women you kept letting in. And the question of what that meant for the room and for the two of you and for the version of things that Joe had been trying to hold together. He left on the 30th of October. He came back every day. You close your eyes. The fire makes a small sound, a coal settling, the faint tick of the metal grate contracting as the heat reduces. The sound is familiar. You have been falling asleep to that sound for 8 months. Outside, the rain has begun. Not heavy rain, a thin, cold November rain that came in off the Thames and sat on the rooftops and ran down the walls and made the cobblestones shine in the gaslight. You can hear it on the roof above you, a sound that is almost rhythmic, almost like something you could sleep to. At some point you are asleep. The room is warm enough. The fire holds. The candle burns down to its last half-inch and gutters and goes out, and the room is dark except for the orange glow of the last coals in the grate, and Miller's Court is quiet except for the rain, and Elizabeth Prater above you is asleep with her chairs pushed against her door, and Mary Ann Cox at the top of the court has gone out again into the rain and will come back at 3 to find your window dark. Outside, Dorset Street is wet and quiet, and the gas lamp at the entrance to Miller's Court makes its small yellow circle in the rain, and the passage is dark beyond the lamp, and the court at the back of the passage is darker still. The rain falls on the roof of number 13, the way rain falls on all roofs in November in London. Without attention, without preference, without knowledge of what is underneath it. It is 2 o'clock in the morning. On Commercial Street, a man named George Hutchinson is walking north. He is 29 or 30 years old, a laborer, a resident of the Victoria Working Men's Home on Commercial Street, one of the model lodging houses that reformers had built in the 1880s, as an alternative to the worst of the private doss houses, a brick building with individual beds rather than communal ones, rules about drinking and behavior, a deputy who maintained order. Hutchinson had been to Romford that day, a town 15 miles to the east, reachable by the Great Eastern Railway, and had come back in the evening with no money, having spent everything he had. He was walking home along Commercial Street in the rain when he saw you. He knew your face. He had known it for some time, the way people in Whitechapel knew each other's faces, by proximity and repetition. by the shared geography of the same few streets and the same few pubs. He lived at the Victoria Working Men's Home, which was on Commercial Street, which meant that your paths crossed regularly in the way that paths crossed in a neighborhood where the same several hundred people circulated through the same several hundred yards of street. The Victoria Working Men's Home at number 39 Commercial Street was one of the larger model lodging houses in Whitechapel, a substantial brick building, 5 floors, built by a charitable trust in the 1870s to provide decent accommodation for working men at a price they could afford. It was a better class of lodging house than the ones on Flower and Dean Street or Thrall Street. It had single beds rather than shared ones, a common room, a reading room with newspapers, a kitchen where residents could cook their own food. The rules were stricter. No women past the front door, no drinking on the premises, a curfew that was enforced. Men who lived there were men who were managing, just barely, to maintain the kind of life that a single working man could maintain in the East End in 1888, which was not a comfortable life, but was a life with edges. Hutchinson had spent the day in Romford, 15 miles to the east, and had come back with nothing. He had been to Romford for reasons he doesn't explain in his statement, work that hadn't materialized, perhaps, or a debt that hadn't been paid, or simply the kind of journey that working men in Whitechapel made occasionally, going out into the Essex countryside where there was sometimes casual agricultural work, or where a man might stay with people he knew and eat something, and return to the city with a few coins more than he left with. He had returned with nothing and was walking home in the rain. You are standing near the entrance to Miller's Court at 2 in the morning in the rain, and when you see Hutchinson you ask him for sixpence. He has no sixpence. He is spent up, he tells you. He says this with some regret. He had borrowed a florin from you at some earlier point and owed you something. But the money was genuinely gone, and he could not give you what he did not have. You say something, possibly something light, the way you talked when you were not quite sober and the night had gone the way it had, and then you move on. You walk south on Commercial Street, toward Thrall Street, and at the junction a man is standing. Not Hutchinson. Another man, a man Hutchinson will describe in exhaustive detail to the police 3 days later. 5'6", 35 years old, pale complexion, dark hair, small mustache, dark coat, felt hat with a wide brim, a long gold chain in his waistcoat, dark spats over light boots, kid gloves in his right hand, a small parcel in his left. A well-dressed man, better dressed than almost anyone who comes to Commercial Street at 2 in the morning. You talk to this man. Hutchinson watches from a distance, near the lamp at the corner, as you and the man stand together on the pavement in the rain. He follows at a distance when you and the man turn back north on Commercial Street and then west on Dorset Street. He stands on the opposite side of Dorset Street as you and the man stop at the entrance to Miller's Court and talk for 3 minutes, the man's arm around your shoulders, your voice carrying faintly through the rain. What you say, what you are recorded as saying, in the statement Hutchinson gives 3 days later is, "All right, my dear, come along, you will be comfortable." Then you lead the man into the passage of Miller's Court. Hutchinson watches. He remains on the opposite side of Dorset Street for 45 minutes, watching the entrance to the court. No one emerges. At 3 o'clock the church clock strikes, and he gives up and goes to find his bed. At 3 o'clock, Mary Ann Cox is walking back to Miller's Court in the rain. She will testify that your window is dark and your room is silent. The room is dark. The rain comes down on Dorset Street, and on Miller's Court, and on the roof of number 13. And the fire in the grate has gone to ash, and the candle is long gone, and the night is at its deepest and its coldest. Inside the room, the print of the fisherman's widow is just a pale shape in the dark. She is looking out at the same empty sea she has always faced, the boat still not there, the cliff edge beneath her still gray and cold. She has been on that wall since before you arrived, and she will be on it after. In the absolute dark of this hour, she is a kind of company. The night moves through its hours. Outside Miller's Court, the gas lamp at the entrance to the passage casts its light onto the rain-slicked cobblestones, and the light moves on the surface of the water in the ruts between the stones, a small, continuous shifting, the way light always moves on water, the way it has been moving on water since long before there was a Dorset Street or a Whitechapel or a London. At 4 in the morning, Elizabeth Prater is woken by her kitten walking across her. She is in the room directly above yours, and the kitten, its name is Diddles. She will mention this at the inquest, the kind of detail that survives because inquests record everything, and everything includes the names of cats, walks across her and wakes her, and she lies in the dark listening to the rain on the roof. And then she hears something. What she hears, what she will testify to under oath, is a cry, a single cry, a woman's voice, 2 words, "Oh, murder," not a scream, not loud, a suppressed cry, was the phrase she used, as if the sound was being held in and only partially escaped. She hears it and she lies still for a moment listening for more, and there is no more, and she turns over and goes back to sleep. Cries of murder in Dorset Street were common enough that a woman could hear one at 4 in the morning and go back to sleep. This is not carelessness. This is what it meant to live in a neighborhood where the common lodging houses generated a constant low-level violence, where a single cry in the night could be anything: a drunk argument, a woman turned out of a doss house, a fight that was over before it started. Elizabeth Prater goes back to sleep. In the room below her, the fire is ash. The candle is gone. The rain falls on the roof. There is a fire burning in the grate. At some point in the night, hot enough to melt the spout off the tin kettle sitting on the mantelpiece. The ash will later contain the remains of clothing, a velvet bonnet, pieces of fabric, burned for light. The investigators will conclude. Burned because the candle was gone and more light was needed, and there was nothing else. The rain has been falling since 1 o'clock. By 3 it is falling harder. By 4 it is the kind of rain that London produces in November. Not violent, not dramatic, just persistent, a cold insistence, the sky having made up its mind. The gutters on Dorset Street run. The cobblestones are wet from edge to edge. At some point in the dark, between 4 o'clock and 5, in that unmeasured stretch of night before any light begins, the room holds everything it has held and gives nothing back. The coat is over the window. The fire is ash. Outside, a cart goes past on Commercial Street. The horse's shoes on the wet stones. The driver hunched against the rain. The cart belongs to one of the early market traders, heading west toward Covent Garden with a load that needs to be there before 7. The driver does not look down Dorset Street. He has no reason to look down Dorset Street. He passes, and the sound of the horse diminishes, and Whitechapel goes back to the particular silence it makes at 4:30 in the morning, which is not silence but is the closest it ever comes. In the dark, There is the sound of the rain easing, the drops on the roof becoming less frequent, less insistent, the sky releasing its grip on the evening's weather and beginning to let it go. The gutters on Dorset Street still run, but more slowly. The cobblestones are still wet, but no longer receiving new water, only holding what they have. There are things in this room that will be documented carefully in the days that follow. The bed, the 3 tables, the chair, the tin bath under the bed, the print above the fireplace, the broken window, the coat that serves as a curtain. On one of the tables, the one nearest the window, there is a clay pipe, a small earthenware pot with the remains of sugar in it, and 2 of Joe Barnett's books, left when he moved out, the ones he had brought from Buller's twice to return, and twice had set back down and not taken. Small books, the kind sold cheaply at the market. One of them has a pressed flower in it, flattened between 2 pages. You put it there yourself, months ago, a piece of something that was growing in a crack between the cobblestones in the court. A yellow thing, small, the kind of weed that found its way through stone in the summer and flowered briefly and died back. You had picked it because it seemed improbable, and you had pressed it in the book because it seemed worth keeping. The investigators will not mention the pressed flower. The inquest will not mention the pressed flower. It is not evidence of anything. There is a letter on one of the tables. You had started it and not finished it. In the days since Joe left, a letter to your family, or the idea of a letter to your family. The first lines of something that kept stopping before it became something. You had written dear and then stopped, because you did not know what name to put after dear. The family was in Wales somewhere, or scattered. Your father might be in Wales still. Your brothers dispersed in the way that the children of working families dispersed, following work, following circumstance. You did not know exactly where they were. You had not known exactly where they were for years. The letter on the table has dear written on it and nothing else, and the ink is dry, and it has been there for days. There are things you did not say and did not write and did not do that there will not now be time to do. This is not a new thought. It has been in the room since August, when Polly Nichols died, since September, when Annie Chapman died, since the end of September, when 2 women died in a single night, and the calculation changed. The thought had been there since then, not precisely formed, not faced directly, but present in the room the way the print above the fireplace was present, not always looked at, but always there. You had wanted to go back to Ireland. Lizzie Albrook knew this. Joe knew this. The Ireland in question was not a specific Ireland. It was not a town or a county you could name precisely, not a house with a door you could knock on and expect to be answered. Your people were in Ireland, you had told Lizzie, and what you meant by that was something older and less specific than an address. A place where the original version of yourself came from. A place where the name Kelly was not borrowed from a landlady, and was not an alias, and was not a name that attached itself to you for a season and fell away. A place where it simply was yours. You had been 25 years old for 8 months. You would have been 26 in the spring. The rain has been falling since 1 o'clock. By 3 it is falling harder. By 4 it is the kind of rain that London produces in November. Not violent, not dramatic, just persistent, a cold insistence, the sky having made up its mind. The gutters on Dorset Street run. The cobblestones are wet from edge to edge. The rain is beginning to ease by 5. And Dorset Street is beginning, slowly and then less slowly, to return to itself. A door opens somewhere. A voice calls out. The smell of coal smoke is beginning. The houses where people had banked their fires well enough through the night, getting them up again. The particular morning smell of fresh coal catching on old embers. Somewhere a child is making the sound that children make in the very early morning, before they are fully awake, before they are fully in the day. The grey light that precedes the sunrise in London in November is a specific kind of light, not dawn exactly, but the first dilution of the dark. The sky going from black to the particular colorless gray that London produces before the sun clears the rooftops. A light without warmth and without color that makes everything visible but nothing bright. It comes slowly. First the shapes of buildings, then the outlines of streets, then the individual stones of the cobblestones. By 6:30 there is enough light to see by. By 7 the lamp at the entrance to Miller's Court is out. The lamplighter's route in Spitalfields in 1888 began in the east and moved west, turning off the lamps in sequence the way they had been lit in sequence the evening before. By 8 Dorset Street is fully awake. The lodging house populations out in the street, the street sellers setting up their barrows, the smell of food from the cookshops on Commercial Street where breakfast could be had for a penny, ha'penny, 2 pence if you wanted more than bread and dripping, a penny for a mug of tea with it. The court is quiet. Elizabeth Prater is out in the court with Diddles the kitten, the cat weaving around her feet. From room 5 there is no sound. Mary Ann Cox came home at 3 and has been asleep since then. The other rooms are producing the ordinary sounds of people getting up, the creak of a floorboard, the splash of water in a basin, a cough, a voice. From room 13, nothing. The coat is still over the broken pane of the window. The window faces the court, and behind the coat and the rag is the interior of a room that is not making any sound. The morning accumulates around the court. Dorset Street has its own morning rhythm, distinct from the rhythms of other streets. By 9 o'clock the lodging house keepers have turned most of their populations out. The common lodging houses operated on a daily basis, payment required each evening, residents expected to vacate by 10 so the rooms could be cleaned and made ready for the next night's occupants. This meant that by 9 in the morning, Dorset Street was full of people who had nowhere particular to be, men and women standing in doorways, sitting on the curb, moving in the slow, purposeless way of people managing a day without a plan. The cookshops were busy. McCarthy's chandler's shop was busy. The street sellers had come in from Commercial Street and set up along the curb, their barrows carrying bread, hot potatoes, second-hand clothing, penny papers. The smell of the street in the morning was different from the smell of the street at night. Coal smoke dominant now, the tanneries and slaughterhouses starting their work. The river smells pushed back by the wind that had come up with the morning, a cold November wind from the northeast. The fog of the previous evening was gone. The sky over Spitalfields was gray and clear, the kind of November sky that gave no warmth but gave light, and in that light the court and the passage and the door of number 13 were just what they appeared to be, a back courtyard, a row of rooms, a door. McCarthy's shop opens at 8. He sells candles, coal, matches, small provisions, the things that the residents of Dorset Street needed on a daily basis and bought in small quantities because they could not afford to buy in large ones. A halfpenny candle, a bucket of coal, a box of matches at a penny. The shop is on the ground floor of 26 Dorset Street, directly fronting the street. and behind it, through the narrow passage, is the courtyard where the rooms are. McCarthy knows all his tenants. He knows their arrears. He knows which ones pay reliably, and which ones pay when pressed, and which ones have to be chased. He had sent Bowyer round twice already this week about the arrears in number 13. Today he is sending him again with the rent book, with the figure written in pencil. 29 shillings. Thomas Bowyer leaves the shop at 11:15. He walks through the passage. He crosses the court. He is carrying the rent book. And in room 13, the night is still there, suspended in the moment before the morning breaks it, in the particular stillness of a room that has been closed since 2 o'clock and will not be opened until nearly 11, when Thomas Bowyer comes through the passage with the rent book in his hand and the arrears written in it in pencil, 29 shillings, and knocks on the door of number 13 and gets no answer, and goes around to the window and reaches through the broken pane to pull the coat aside. It is 10:45 in the morning. Thomas Bowyer is the assistant to John McCarthy. McCarthy has sent him to collect what he can, or to arrange something, a plan, a date, anything that could be written beside the figure in the book. Bowyer knows the tenant of number 13 by sight. He has seen her in the court and on Dorset Street, the young woman with the white apron. He knocks on the door of number 13. There is no answer. He goes around to the window and reaches through the broken pane and moves the coat aside to look in. What he sees in that room he will carry for the rest of his life. He goes back through the passage and onto Dorset Street and directly to McCarthy's shop, and he tells McCarthy what he saw. McCarthy will later describe Bowyer's face in that moment as one he would not forget. The two men go together to Commercial Street Police Station, and they tell the duty officer what Bowyer found, and the machinery of the investigation begins. Inspector Frederick Aberline arrives at Miller's Court within the hour. Aberline is 50 years old, a career detective, the officer who has been leading the Whitechapel murders investigation since August. He has been at every scene. He has read every report. He has interviewed hundreds of people in the neighborhood, women who worked these streets, landlords of the lodging houses, publicans, street sellers, anyone who might have seen something, heard something, know something. He knows Whitechapel better than most men alive. He stands at the entrance to Miller's Court and looks at the door of number 13 and does not enter. He is waiting for the bloodhounds. This is one of the stranger facts of the morning of the 9th of November, 1888, and it is fully documented in the police records. Aberline has been instructed to wait for 2 bloodhounds, Burgo and Barnaby, before allowing anyone to disturb the scene. The bloodhounds had been lent to the Metropolitan Police by a breeder named Edwin Bruce some weeks earlier as a new investigative technique, the idea being that dogs might track a scent that no human investigation could follow. The Home Office had been enthusiastic. The press had reported on it. Scotland Yard had been publicly committed to the idea. What no one had told Aberline was that Bruh had collected his dogs back 3 weeks earlier, after it became clear that Scotland Yard had no intention of paying him or insuring them. The dogs were in Scarborough. They had been in Scarborough for 3 weeks. There were no bloodhounds. Aberline waits 2 hours. He stands at the entrance to the passage, and his officers block off Dorset Street to pedestrians, and the crowd that is gathered on both sides of the cordon watches and does not know what is being looked at. Some of them know. Some have heard what Bowyer saw. the information passing through Dorset Street at the speed that information passed through Dorset Street, which was very fast, which was faster than almost anything else that moved through the neighborhood. Some of the women in the crowd are women who worked these streets and knew your face and knew what building that was and what room was behind that door. And they are standing in the November morning with their arms folded against the cold and their faces showing something that is not quite readable from a distance. The court itself, during the wait, is quiet in the way of a place where something has happened, and everyone can feel that something has happened, and nobody has been officially told. Elizabeth Prater is in the court. She has brought Diddles in from outside, the cat tucked against her chest, and she is standing near the entrance to the passage and not going any further. Mary Ann Cox came down at some point after 9 and is standing near Elizabeth Prater, and the two of them are talking in low voices. John McCarthy is not in the court. He is at Commercial Street Police Station, and then he is wherever Aberline needs him. And then he is at the entrance to the passage with a pickaxe at 1:30 when the order finally comes. The door opens inward. It takes several blows. The court fills with the quiet that follows the kind of discovery that cannot be undone. The police work proceeds. A photographer is brought, the only time in the entire series of Whitechapel murders that a photographer was brought to a scene, and the photographs are taken. Dr. Thomas Bond, the divisional surgeon, makes his examination. His report will note, among other things, the extensive nature of the injuries, the folded clothing on the chair beside the bed, the remains of cloth in the fire grate, the melted kettle spout. His report will be one of the most detailed medical documents produced in connection with the Whitechapel murders. It will not be made public for many decades. 4 doctors examined the body that afternoon. The Metropolitan Police has never brought this much medical expertise to a single scene. The scene has never required it. Your clothes are folded neatly beside the bed. The investigators note this and cannot fully account for it. The clothing folded, placed carefully on the chair, as if you had undressed in a normal way, as if the evening had ended in the ordinary fashion. The tin bath is under the bed where it always was. The print of the fisherman's widow is still on the wall above the fireplace, the woman in it still looking out to sea. The inquest opens on the 12th of November at Shoreditch Town Hall. The coroner is Dr. Roderick MacDonald. The inquest lasts 1 day, a single day, which the press criticizes as inadequate. The Daily Telegraph publishes an article the following morning noting that the proceedings terminated before any further witnesses could be brought, before Kelly's relatives could be located to formally identify the body. Her relatives are never located. No family member comes forward. No one arrives from Wales, from Ireland, from Cardiff, from anywhere. The people who knew Mary Jane Kelly before London, before the West End, before Whitechapel, before Miller's Court, do not come. Joe Barnett attends the inquest. He identifies the body by the ear and the eyes, which is what remains recognizable. He is asked whether he is certain. He says that he is certain. He is the only person in the room who can say so. And he says it, and that is the identification that will stand. He does not look like a man who will recover from this quickly. The inquest reporters, several of them, note his appearance. The grief visible in the face, the composure that is effortful and visible as effortful, the way he answers the coroner's questions in short, careful sentences that contain no more and no less than what is asked. He had left her 3 weeks ago. He had visited every day. He had been there the evening before, had sat in the chair, had asked if she needed anything. She had told him she was all right. The funeral is on the 19th of November, 10 days after the discovery. 10 days in which the newspapers have moved on. Partially, there are always other stories. There are always other things, and in which the neighborhood has absorbed the fact of what happened in room 13, the way neighborhoods absorb facts, slowly and incompletely, and with the particular knowledge that comes from proximity, from having heard the singing, from having seen the face, from knowing the white apron. The hearse leaves the Shoreditch mortuary at 12:30 on a gray November Monday. The coffin is oak and elm, polished. There are 2 floral wreaths on the lid, and a cross made of heart's ease. A small flower, purple and yellow, the common name for the wild pansy, and the brass plate reads Marie Jeanette Kelly, because that is the name Joe chose, the French version, the name from the years before Dorset Street, the name that reached back for something better and held it, the name he had given the undertaker specifically, the one he wanted on the plate. Joe Barnett is there. John McCarthy is there. The Catholic priest is there because you were Catholic, born into it in Limerick, the way Irish families were born into it in the 1860s, baptized at the church on the same day as most of the other things that happened in the first weeks of a life. And Joe and McCarthy had pushed for that, had waited the extra days it required to arrange a Catholic burial, had gone to the diocese and sorted the paperwork. They had done this for you. They had done this because there was no family to do it and someone had to. No family comes. The cortege is 2 mourning carriages, and the hearse, the oak and elm coffin inside it with its wreaths and its heart's ease and its brass plate, moving through the streets of East London toward Leytonstone. The route takes it through Whitechapel and along the Mile End Road, and then out toward the east, through the parts of London that blurred at the edges into something that was not quite the city anymore. The yards and the waste ground and the low terraces that preceded the Essex countryside. The sky opening up slightly, the density of the buildings thinning. Along the route there are people watching. This is documented. The crowds that gathered to watch the funeral cortege of Mary Jane Kelly, who had been Mary Jane Davies in Wales, who had been Marie Jeanette in the West End, who had been Dark Mary and Ginger and Fair Emma and the woman who always wore the white apron on Commercial Street. The crowds who came out of their houses and their lodging houses and their shops and stood on the pavement as the hearse went past. The crowd, as the cortege passes, cries out. God forgive her, they cry. We will not forget her. This is reported in the newspapers of the 20th of November, 1888. The crowd in the streets of East London, the people who had lived in the same streets and the same poverty, the people who understood, without needing it explained, what a life like yours cost and what it meant and what was lost when it ended. They said, we will not forget her. The grave is in St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery at Leytonstone. It was reclaimed in the 1950s, the way many graves in crowded urban cemeteries are reclaimed. In 1986, a man named John Morrison erected a headstone, but it marked the wrong grave. The headstone was removed. In the 1990s, the area superintendent placed a simple marker, a small stone, correctly located. Marie Jeanette Kelly, 1863 to 1888. Miller's Court no longer exists. Dorset Street no longer exists. The whole geography of it, the passage, the courtyard, the 6 rooms, the gas lamp at the entrance, was demolished in the 20th century. as part of the slum clearance programs that eventually replaced the worst of the East End rookeries with other buildings, other streets, other uses. Where Miller's Court was, there is now a car park attached to Spitalfields Market. The market itself is still there, a covered market on the site of the old Spitalfields fruit and vegetable market, now selling antiques and food and clothing to a very different population than the one that moved through these streets in 1888. The iron columns of the original market building are still standing. They were there in 1888. You would have walked past them on the way to the 10 Bells. But Christ Church is still there. Nicholas Hawksmoor's great white stone frontage still looming over Fournier Street the way it loomed in 1888, the bells still ringing the hours. The bells you heard from Commercial Street at 9 o'clock on the evening of the 8th of November are the same bells, the same peal, in the same tower, above the same steps where people have sat in all weathers since 1729. The 10 Bells is still on the corner of Commercial Street and Fournier Street, its Victorian tiling intact, the blue and white floral pattern on the walls, the mural on the north side depicting Spitalfields weavers in the old days. The pub fills on weekend evenings the way it filled in 1888, with the noise of many people in a warm room, bodies close together, voices over each other, the smell of drink and the warmth of gas, or what has replaced gas, which produces the same warmth in the same room. Commercial Street is still Commercial Street. Brick Lane is still Brick Lane, though the industry that gave it its name is gone, and the population that lives along it now is different from the population that lived there in 1888. And the population of 1888 was different from the population before it. And this is what streets do. They hold the name and change the content, the geography persisting while everything that happens in it is replaced. What was Whitechapel is still Whitechapel, though the Whitechapel of 1888 is gone as thoroughly as Miller's Court, gone in its poverty, in its lodging houses, in its particular configuration of desperation and survival, gone in the specific way that places go when the conditions that made them are dismantled, which is to say not demolished but dissolved, replaced over decades by different conditions, different buildings, different populations, different needs. But the street is still there, and the church is still there. And if you stood on Commercial Street at night in November and listened past the current noise, the traffic, the voices, the music from the bars, all the noise of a city that has changed beyond recognition and not changed at all, you might hear, underneath everything, the continuous sound of a place where millions of people are alive at the same time, going about the business of being alive. The sound that was there in 1888 and is there now. You had blue eyes and fair skin, and you always wore a clean white apron, and you never wore a hat. You had been to France and had not liked it. You had wanted to go back to Ireland. You had a good singing voice, and you sang Irish songs when you were drinking. And on the last night of your life you sang for an hour or more in a small room in a dark court off the worst street in London, and the neighbors heard you through the walls. Let that be what remains. Not the room, not the photographs in the police archive, not the 130 years of speculation about a man whose identity no one ever established and no one ever will. Let what remains be this: a young woman singing in a room in November, the fire going, the candle lit, the song she had known since childhood filling the small space of her life and coming through the walls and being heard. The neighbors heard her singing. They heard her. Let the night be long, and let the room be warm, and let the fire hold against the cold, and let the song go on a little longer, into the dark, into the November fog over Spitalfields, into the sound that the city makes when it breathes at night, endless and indifferent and alive. Good night. If this story reached you tonight, if you are one of the people who listened all the way to the end, please consider subscribing to Quiet History at Bedtime. Every subscriber makes the next story possible. Leave a like if you would like to see more. We will be here again with another life, another room, another voice from a long time ago. Sleep well.